Hello and welcome to the Thriving Abroad podcast, where through great conversation with expats and relocation experts, we discuss how to get the most out of international relocation and living. I'm Louise Wiles, your host for these conversations, a change and transition coach and consultant. I support expats as they create lives and careers they love while living overseas. Through these great conversations, I dig deep into the important relocation topics highlighted in my book, Thriving Abroad, the definitive guide to professional and personal relocation success. We discuss the challenges and opportunities of international living and provide insights, ideas and inspirations for creating individual and family success abroad. You'll find the podcast blog at thrivingabroad.com, where I post a blog for each episode containing helpful links and tips from our conversation, and provide access to a full transcript. You can also register to receive regular podcast news with our podcast newsletter. And so on to today's conversation. This conversation with Louise Ross is probably one of my favourites, partly because of the connection, you'll learn more about that in a moment, but also because I'm a narrative coach and I work closely with people's stories, and that's what this episode is all about. You know, there's great power in recording and sharing your personal story as a way of making sense of your journey, of your choices and experiences, and also the value that those stories can offer to others. In our conversation today, Louise shares what she took from the stories in her book, Women Who Walk. We talk about what Louise learned from these ladies, the common themes, the challenges, the personal qualities that shone through, and why Louise believes people are drawn to a mobile lifestyle. I think you're going to find many things that resonate with you today, and perhaps spark you to consider writing your own life stories. We provide tips and insights for doing so on the podcast blog that accompanies this episode. So I hope you enjoy this episode, and I'll see you on the other side. Bye-bye for now. Hello and welcome to the Thriving Abroad podcast. I'm Louise Wiles, your host for these conversations, and I'm really excited to welcome to the podcast today, Louise Ross. Hi, Louise.
Hi Louise.
Hi, Louise. Yes, Louise and Louise.
It is the two Louises. Thanks for inviting me onto your show.
It's really great to have you joining us today, Louise. Let me introduce you a little bit and tell everyone a little bit about you. Louise is originally from Australia, and she has lived abroad for 35 years, first in the UK, then France and the United States. 6 years ago, Louise moved to Portugal, and in Portugal from 2015 to 17, she was president of the executive board of the International Women in Portugal, IWP. Currently, she is president of IWP's member representative board. Louise has a master's in psychology and counselling, practicing for only a few years, after which she applied her training to an eclectic entrepreneurial career. And this year, Louise released her sixth book, Women Who Walk, How 20 Women from 16 Countries Came to Live in Portugal. And that really is going to form the focus for our conversation today. Here's the book, so you can see it. And I'm really excited to be talking to Louise about this, particularly because as well as sharing the same name, we share a bit of common ground in terms of me and Louise having lived in Portugal and in the same sort of area of Portugal, near Cascais, just outside Lisbon. I was also a member of IWP 10, or perhaps even 15 years ago now. Actually it is, yes, that's scary, even more than that. But IWP for me was a lifesaver when I first moved to Lisbon, when my husband's job relocated there from Madrid, and I didn't have children, so I didn't have the usual sort of school route for making friends, and IWP was my lifesaver. I made some wonderful friends through IWP. So really lovely to go and talk about your book today, Louise, and with that strong connection to Portugal. So perhaps you could start by telling us a little more about you.
Okay.
the path that led you to choose to make Portugal your home, and then the big question, what led you to write this book?
Okay. 2 questions in one. So, as per my bio, I'm originally from Australia, and in my 20s, I found my way to Boulder, Colorado to do graduate studies in Jungian psychology, and that's where I ended up living for many years. But by my mid-40s, I really wanted to leave the US, and I knew I didn't want to go back to Australia, so I thought maybe back to Europe, where I'd lived and worked in my early 20s. And then in 2011, I was at a workshop in Mexico where I met a Portuguese woman who I subsequently visited several times over the course of the next couple of years. And it was in the winter of 2013 when I was on the Estoril coastline, sitting in the sun at an outdoor cafe on the promenade, and I thought, oh boy, I could live here. And 5 months later, I'd sold up everything and moved here. And once I'd arrived and got situated, I knew I'd need to connect with other internationals in order to help establish a network of new friends and a life for myself. And so within a few weeks, I became a member of the organisation you mentioned, International Women in Portugal. And as you do when meeting new people, particularly in an international community, I often found myself asking questions such as, where are you from? Or how did you come to be here and why Portugal? And over time, I think my questions went a bit deeper, and that's when I started to hear some fascinating personal stories, really the calibre of which I'd not heard in my previous life. And I began to wonder, am I the only one that thinks these stories are worth recording for posterity? And that's where it began.
Fantastic. And I know you interviewed 26 women, edited down to 20 for the book. And what struck me as I read those stories was the sheer diversity of the women's life experiences that curiously all led them to live in Portugal. And I believe the majority at one time or other were members of IWP and had joined the activity The Sintra Walk, which was an activity when I was there, not that I was participating in that one, although I was activity coordinator for IWP, so I knew all about it.
Okay.
But I know that that's where you spoke to some of your interviewees. So as you interviewed and transcribed and edited the stories, what did you learn from them about these women?
Yeah. You know, there were several women who were open to me interviewing them, but they were hesitant because they didn't believe that they or their life story were noteworthy. And their response was something along lines of, but my story is not interesting. There are many more women in this community with far more interesting stories to tell. And frankly, I found this quite unsettling because it sounded to me as though they did not value their experiences, and experiences that were rich and varied, exciting and inspiring, and unsettling because there is this tendency that women have to discount their story as less than, or not as important, or not noteworthy, or not of value. And what I know to be true, and what documenting these stories confirmed for me, is that the truth of women's lives matter. Whether it's the personal triumphs and disappointments, educational and professional achievements and failures, travels, adventures and discoveries, the decision to marry or not marry, the decision to have or not have children. Valuing our story is wholly important to a woman's self-esteem, her sense of self and sense of place within her family, community and in the world. And I also learned how enriching it can be to take the time to listen. I think in conversation, particularly these days, we're too often ready to jump in with our own story, or we get impatient and distracted and fail to really hear someone. But when you take the time to listen, to go just a little deeper in conversation, you can learn so much from one another. For instance, I knew many of the women I interviewed either from the Central Walk or social gatherings, or perhaps a mutual friend had introduced us. But until I interviewed them, I didn't really know them at all. For example, one of the women is a geophysicist. And I didn't even know what that was till Audrey told me about her education, her field research, and then her work with Shell Oil in the Middle East. So in that sense, interviewing, transcribing and editing the women's stories was edifying. It was like going back to school and doing a study abroad program. And that, to me, is in fact the beauty of being immersed in an international community. We have the chance to learn so much from one another, but you do have to be open and willing to listen. And I finish off the introduction to the book with a quote from Barack Obama, and I have to read it because it's so relevant, and he was such a great orator. And he said, "I learned that if you listen hard enough, everybody's got a sacred story, an organising story of who they are and what their place in the world is. And they're willing to share it with you if they feel as if you actually care about it. And that ends up being the glue around which relationships are formed and trust is formed and communities are formed. And ultimately, that's the glue around which democracies work."
Mm.
So I really did learn quite a bit.
I think that's a really powerful message to all of us, actually, to perhaps take time out to think about people's stories and whether we really do know them, and perhaps could take time to ask a few more questions when we sit and have coffee and hear each other speak. So I am sure as you listen to these stories and these really interesting experiences, probably what popped out were some observations and insights into the different qualities that these women possessed that had helped them through their experiences. I mean, some of them quite intense experiences, I think, and multiple life changes for various reasons. So are you able to point to any common strengths and characteristics that you could sort of draw from these stories about these women?
Yeah, absolutely. Without a doubt, courage. The book opens with Dahlia's story, and she grew up in Beirut during the Civil War, and it's a pretty unnerving read. The family ends up emigrating to Canada, but at the end of the war, where they start over. And actually, there's another story like this too. It's Sandias, whose family left everything behind in Mozambique at the point at which the former Portuguese colonies in Africa were fighting for independence. Anyway, Sandia's family starts again in Lisbon. And then as a young woman, she enters an arranged marriage, has a baby, and her husband decides that they should go to Angola as there'll be commercial opportunities for them in the midst of that civil war. And there was another woman in the book who also lived through the war in South America, the Contra War. And, it's hard to imagine the courage it took for these women to navigate the challenges of raising families or living their life through these modern day wars, if you like. And then curiosity or cultural curiosity. For instance, Sally Hastings is plucked out of a very sheltered life in Middle America and flown to Paris to begin a modelling career at 16. And when she arrives, bless her, she's so naive, she's shocked to discover that the French speak another language and it's not English. But instead of packing it all in and going home because it's all too different and overwhelming, she has the gumption and the curiosity to not only learn the language, but to find a life and a home in France for many years, and then ultimately a life for herself here in Portugal. And then resilience. I think of Joanne, who grew up on a cocoa plantation in the jungles of New Guinea and eventually went on to marry and raise 4 children in 7 different countries. And Richard, her husband, is incredibly restless and probably won't ever settle. And no matter, Joanne rolls with it, creating a life for herself and carving out time to do what she wants to do. And Jo and her husband have actually become good friends. And what I've come to see is that they have a marriage that works because there is a great deal of mutual respect for their idiosyncrasies and humour. Agency. By that I mean the capacity to act independently and make your own choices. And this reminds me of Birgit, who's from Germany, and who very early on is called to a life dedicated to a spiritual practice, such that she heads off to India at 20 to follow a guru. And of course her parents are very much against it. But she goes because it's like her personal mandate, following her spiritual calling. And it leads her into all sorts of situations in various countries. But she is her own agent and demonstrates a great deal of free will and adaptability. Of course, all the women in the book are adaptable. I mean, their life choices are dependent on them being flexible and comfortable with change. Otherwise, they wouldn't have wound up living in various countries, leading less conventional, somewhat peripatetic international lives before finding their way to Portugal.
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting to hear you mention all of those. So courage, curiosity, cultural curiosity, resilience, humour, responsibility, adaptability, flexibility. I mean, these are all characteristics that often are included in assessments that are used for international assignees working for organisations. Right. And they're looking at people who they think will be successful and will, flourish and thrive in new locations. And so I wonder also how many people listening now, as you hear that, whether you can identify those strengths in yourself. I suspect you probably can. There's certainly strengths that come across when I'm sort of coaching people who live this kind of life that I hear frequently. So really, really nice to hear those and how they featured in those stories.
Yes.
So I'm also wondering, all the women are expats and they've lived through sort of multiple moves at different stages of their lives. Were there sort of themes that came out to you about sort of how they were approaching their lives and experiencing those lives that were apparent to you?
Yeah. Yes, again, absolutely. Straddling countries and cultures, like having one foot in the host country and one foot in the country of origin. And to me, this led to issues of identity, particularly when we closely identify with or are very attached to our national identity. One of the interviewees has 2 kids that are now adults and they're TCKs. And when the son was little and travelling with his mum, he struck up a conversation with a stranger who asked him, "Where are you from?" And apparently he answered, "I'm a citizen of the world," which is pretty sophisticated for a little kid. But I think that's the reality for many TCKs who tend to be cultural hybrids or cultural chameleons with an expanded worldview or outlook on life.
Yeah.
Restlessness seems to be particular to a number of the women in the book who have embraced a peripatetic lifestyle. And this leads into issues or the question of where is home? And I notice for some, this becomes more of an issue the longer they're out of their country of origin. In presentations, I've often quoted this wonderful meme that I found online, and it's, "Home is not a place, it's a feeling." And when I say that at presentations, you can just hear this collective, this sort of sigh of, yes, that's right. Returning to one's country of origin, or in short I call it the return, I think is a complicated topic, and that turns up in several of the women's stories. In fact, one of the women says, "I don't believe in going back." And that's because Penny didn't grow up in her parents' country of origin, the UK, but she did go to boarding school there. And then when she graduated, she worked in London for a short period, but as an adult TCK who'd spent her early years in Brazil, she had no affinity with the UK. So understandably, she doesn't believe in going back because simply she doesn't feel at home there. It's not where she feels she belongs. So yes, feeling like an outsider in yours or your parents' country of origin came up. For one of the interviewees, who's from the Netherlands, this was particularly challenging when she chose to return, but not because she wanted to go back, but she couldn't find work to sustain herself here in Portugal. Anyway, when I followed up with her to find out how she was getting on, she sent me a Maya Angelou quote that she said had really helped her come to terms with her return. And I'm going to read that quote because it's really again quite apt. You are only free when you realise you belong no place. You belong every place, no place at all. The price is high, the reward is great. And then the last thing, which was new to me, I'd not heard this before, but the trailing spouse. So one of the interviewees introduced it to me. And actually, I find this moniker kind of disparaging because when you look up trailing, synonyms like rambling, behind, losing, dawdling, and lagging come up. So in my mind, trailing spouse dishonours the sacrifices made by the following spouse, whether it's the wife or the husband, because many husbands follow their wives to work locations now. And so I don't really like following spouse either, but perhaps there's another moniker for this phenomena. Are you aware?
I agree. No, trailing spouse. So when I first started working in this area, so 10 years ago, trailing spouse, well, I was doing a master's. Actually, this is when I was living in Portugal, a master's in occupational psychology, and I did my research project was all about, expatriation. And in that, I used the term trailing spouse because that's how partners or assignees were referred to in the research literature. So that's where it kind of originated as a term. But I prefer to use, I've used accompanying spouse or partner, expat partner. Definitely never used trailing spouse in mine.
Right, yeah. But it is still commonly used,
yeah. It kind of amuses me for two reasons. Trailing is because of all the sort of derogatory, as you just said, terminology around that, but also spouse kind of assumes marriage, and that's not always the case these days either. So, for various reasons, it's really not very relevant. But those themes are the themes that I hear so often. One of the ones that is particularly topical at the moment in much of the sort of global mobility arena is that of repatriation, going home, and the challenge that people have, particularly serial assignees who've perhaps had 3 or 4 moves around the world and then go back home. And as I've discovered, you never go, and I think, as you said, you never do go back. You can go. Perhaps it's home, but never go back to what it was. Things move on, life moves on, people move on, and have that mindset of going, back to what was before.
Yes, that's right.
So.
Because we have this fantasy in our mind or this imagination or imagining of what home is, but it's stuck in the past. So when you go back, the reality doesn't meet our fantasy of what home is anymore. So it's quite confronting, I think.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right. So for me, I found I've moved back to the UK twice now, and each time it's probably been, I wouldn't say it's more challenging because it's challenging in a different way to moves abroad, but I guess the one thing that has really struck me is that friendships move on. So you kind of go back and think, those people are still around, but actually you go back at a different stage in your life. They have different things going on. It will never go back to, exactly as it was before. And I think for people going back to companies and integrating back into their home companies, they find that really challenging as well because they've moved on so much, whereas people at home don't see what has moved on. And that, for me, has been one of the challenging things because people back home don't think to ask or be particularly interested in what's happened abroad. And on the whole, don't get that. So unless they've lived abroad too. So I sometimes feel like I've written out 10 years of my life or 15 years of my life because I very rarely speak about it. And that's a challenge. Kind of find another way to cope with that yourself.
One of the things I actually suggested to a friend that had recently returned to Australia after living abroad for many years was to get involved in the International Women's Organisation in Sydney. And at first she was like, "Rah," because she's from Sydney, but she did, and she said it's been a lifesaver because she's connecting with other Australians and other Australians who've lived abroad, and then other international women who are living in Australia. So, I mean, these communities are global. They're everywhere. So it doesn't really matter where you live. Even if you return to your home country, if you've lived outside of your home country, it makes sense to me to then find other people who have lived the same life. So you can have that conversation so that you're not in a situation of feeling like a part of your identity is completely shut down in the effort to reintegrate.
Yeah.
You need to be able to share those experiences and those conversations with someone that says, you know, I know exactly what you mean. I had that experience too.
Yeah. And that's exactly, and I suppose I get the benefit of doing what I do. So I'm speaking to people all the time who are thinking about moving abroad. So that is my topic so I still have that part of me. So I guess I probably don't need it so much. I don't search for it so much in my locality, although I am involved in families in transition. And so a regular dose of that when I want to, which is great. So
when you go to the conferences.
Really looking for something to help you continue, that kind of, that story, that part of you.
Yes, because it's such a rich story, and to just back burner it in order to try and fit in just doesn't seem right. It's very much a part of who you've become.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so there were a few challenges you mentioned there. So that kind of makes me wonder, what is it that kind of motivates people to do this, to move abroad, and to, what draws them and inspires them to undertake a mobile life, and build new lives in new locations and countries, and then decide to do it all over again and move on again. Was that a question that intrigued you as you listened to these stories? Because I know quite a number of them did move multiple times.
Yes. Well, the reality is I set out to explore 3 questions which are stated on the back cover of the book, and they are: what compels someone to leave their country of origin, and what happens to them on the journey to the new place, and then what causes them to land somewhere and decide to stay, if not for the rest of their lives, then for an extended period. And without directly asking each interviewee these questions, every woman inadvertently answered them just by telling her story. And I think their answers are nicely summed up in a quote at the beginning of the book by Nana Adu. So I'm going to pull up my book again. Nana Adu is the president of Ghana, and in an address to Emmanuel Macron, president of France, he said, "The movement of people is as old as man. There is nothing new about it, and it has always been linked to the same thing, the failure of where you are to provide you with an opportunity, and so you move somewhere else." But there's something else to this too, which has been getting quite a bit of press in recent years, because people are so mobile these days, and apparently it's genetic. There's a mutant gene which has been identified, and it's known as DRD4-7R, or the restless gene, because it's been correlated to increased levels of curiosity and restlessness, which was one of those characteristics I mentioned earlier, but specifically a passion for travel and the ability to embrace change and movement and adventure, which are all characteristics that the women demonstrate. And it's an interesting theory, but way more complex than what I've just described. So the quote suggesting that this is a passion for change and movement and adventure is as old as man, it's really accurate. It's fascinating. But if listeners are curious to learn more, there's a great article in a 2013 edition of National Geographic, and it can be easily found just by Googling National Geographic restless gene. It's a long article, but very insightful.
I'll put a link to that on the thrivingabroad.com podcast website. So look for this episode and you'll find that link there.
Oh, that'd be a great idea.
Yeah. So it's interesting to think, does sort of a genetic predisposition to mobility, but then I suspect also once you've moved, you kind of you develop that, or give space to that gene to develop, and then you.
That's right.
So it's a question of nature and nurture, isn't it?
Exactly. And essentially that's what the article talks about.
I'm just thinking, I'm laughing in a way because I'm just thinking, if you're sitting there thinking, I'm thinking about moving abroad, but I'm not sure I have that restless gene, don't worry, because in every other way it sounds like it's an attraction and something you want to do, then don't worry about the gene. Because I don't think I ever had the gene. When I think back to our first move, I was actually quite happy not to move anywhere. But my husband, who has moved as a child many times, and he had already had that restless gene. So if I didn't want to move anywhere, I probably should never have married him, really. But then I think I developed that love of movement. And now, having been back in the UK 5 years, we often have a conversation about, well, where can we go next?
Where are we going to move next? Yeah. And you're right, there's that nature nurture thing. And so because your children have had that experience of living abroad and very formative years abroad, in fact, chances are they will seek that experience out as young adults and may well live abroad at some point. So again, the article kind of addresses the manner in which both the behaviour, I suppose, and the genetic component is passed on.
Yeah. And I guess it's a characteristic that people do say of third culture kids, that when they relocate as a child, they carry that curiosity and travel bug with them. Yeah.
Yes, they do. Yeah. Oh, interestingly, I'm just going to interject with a brief story. One of the interviewees talks about her children, and they're all TCKs, and 3 of them lived abroad, but one of them he settled and then he refused to travel. And she was worried that they had, permanently damaged his desire to travel by being so restless as a family when he was growing up and living in so many different countries. So it can have the opposite effect too, I think.
Yeah, and I think there are some studies that suggest that, either children are encouraged, as adults feel this need to move regularly, or the actual opposite happens and they decide to settle. So, either way, So was there anything else, about the book or about the stories that sort of struck you that you would like to share?
One more quote. I wanted to just mention that at the beginning, I chose these quotes for a reason. So the first one is from the travel writer Jan Morris, and the quote is, "I spent half my life travelling in foreign places. I've only lately come to see that incessant wandering as an outer expression of my inner journey." And I love this quote because it took me back to my graduate studies when I was immersed in my own self-analysis, and I was doing quite a bit of reading by Joseph Campbell, an American professor of literature, whose writing on comparative mythology resulted in his main work, which was a book titled The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And in this book, he introduced the concept of the monomyth, or the hero's journey, which has found its way into popular culture now. So the hero is a man or a woman, and in and the hero appears in world mythology, great literature and film, answering the call to adventure and following their own path, or her own path, and venturing forth into uncharted territory where they encounter many trials and tribulations, which tests their courage. And what the hero does with these experiences is use them as an opportunity to grow, evolve, and transform. So great movies follow this arc. Just by way as an example, you may, or listeners might have seen the movie that won the Oscar this year, which was Green Book. Mm-hmm. And the two main characters literally go on a journey, a road trip, and we watch them encounter trials and tribulations and grow and evolve as a result. And in Women Who Walk, there's a similar arc to each story, which is exemplary, I think, of travelling as an outer expression of the inner journey, which is the hero's journey, or the universal human experience of transformation.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. That's I think that's a wrap, actually.
Yeah, probably.
Perhaps the benefit, it just makes me think, actually, as everyone's listening, and if you're feeling that your international life is challenging at the moment and stretching you, then that's because it is, and that no sort of change and transition of this form is ever totally easy. Yeah. So I think that's a really important point to make, and that is part of your hero's journey, and I love that.
Yes. Right. And one of the interesting aspects of the hero's journey too is that sometimes we don't answer that call to adventure because it does seem so overwhelming. So, you were saying that perhaps you wouldn't have embarked on your overseas adventure if your husband hadn't been so restless. Sometimes it does take a partner or someone to nudge us to answer that call and go, okay, I think I can do this. Okay, I will do it. And then once you get going, then off you go on the journey, and then your life sort of opens up. But yeah, sometimes there is in the hero's journey, I think that there is a character that can enter your life that encourages you to embark on your journey of transformation, whether it's metaphoric or literal, like for instance a husband, partner, or teacher, or therapist, or coach, or whoever. Yeah. But sometimes there is that person in your life that might nudge you along.
Opens the door slightly for you.
Opens the door, yeah. The door opener, yeah.
The door opener, yeah. Brilliant. Well, I think we're coming to the end of our time. It's a lovely conversation, and I've really enjoyed hearing about the stories in this book. And I the more I think about it, the more I see the value in recording these stories. And I know that's something you feel strongly about that. So would you like to share your thoughts on that? Yes.
As I mentioned to you just before your show started, I was in The Hague recently, and I discovered the Expatriate Archive Centre there. And there's enormous opportunity in expatriate communities around the world to document their stories because these communities are so mobile these days. And wherever there's an international women's clubs, there are usually activities, as we mentioned earlier. This all evolved for me because of the hiking activity. But one of those activities could be a club blog where the stories of women of the organisation are recorded, or mini recordings, podcasts along lines of what you're doing, perhaps just little short ones, but that these mini memoirs can be collated for the purposes of donation to the Expatriate Archive Centre in The Hague. And in fact, the tagline for the centre is Home for Expat Life Stories. Or they can be for the local community to learn more about their expatriate neighbours, or they can simply be for members within those clubs to learn more about the life stories of their members. So I think there's just enormous opportunity within our global expatriate communities to record our stories. And
I think it's a two-way positive street, isn't it? Because the very active recording our stories means that we think through our stories ourselves, and there's personal benefit in that, and collating it all and putting out that meaning for ourselves as well. So definitely worth doing. So I know you've got one project on the go, another project on the go, another book writing project. So just share a little bit about that with us.
Yes, I can do that. So I'm now documenting the male expatriate narrative, the journey that men have taken from their country of origin en route to Portugal. And so I'm interviewing men who've taken the road less travelled, which is to say men who've made unconventional or different life choices, and perhaps they're unsung heroes in some way. And so far I've interviewed 7 men and transcribed their stories, and it's fascinating to observe the differences, firstly in the way men tell their stories, and then secondly, one of the things that so clearly is a gender difference is the level of freedom that men take for granted in the way they move around the world and cross borders, whether it's solo or because of their work. I mean, the women just seem to encounter more restrictions, whether it was self-imposed or from family or from work or whatever. I mean, men just don't seem to have that level of sense of restriction in their life. So yeah, I'm really enjoying it. I'm starting to feel like a social scientist recording this slice of time and in this kind of culturally diverse global mobile population.
Fantastic. I've never really thought of mobility in that sense, in terms of being having some element of gender inequality to it. I mean, I do in terms of organisations and female assignees, because we know that there are less than there are male assignees, although that is beginning to equal out at the moment. That's going the right way in that sense, but I get the freedom issue to travel and to do, definitely, whether that's self-imposed, which sometimes it is, or just circumstances imposed. Definitely can relate to that. Yeah. So Louise, thank you so much for sharing all your insights and thoughts about the stories. If anyone would like to go and buy a copy of the book, it's available on Amazon, I know that. And if you want to learn more about Louise, I know you can go to your website, which is louiseross.com. Brilliant. Okay, and I will put links to all of that in the blog post that accompanies this podcast. So
okay. Thank you so much, Louise. It's been a real pleasure and an honour to be on your show.
Well, it's been lovely having you to join the show and talking about your book. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I really hope you enjoyed that conversation. I certainly did. Please come and share your reactions and insights in the closed Thriving Abroad Facebook group. If you're not already a member, go to Facebook, find the group and ask to join, and it will be lovely to see you inside. I've posted a short video asking a few questions relating to this podcast. So I'd love you to come and respond to those and for us to get a conversation going. That's all for today. To access the show notes and transcript for today, go to thrivingabroad.com, and I'll be back soon with the next instalment in the Thriving Abroad podcast series. If I can help you in any way to make sense of your expat journey, then please reach out, either via Facebook or louise@louisewiles.com. So wherever this podcast finds you in the world, I wish you a really great week, and I will be back soon with the next episode. Bye-bye for now.